Welcome and thank you for returning so promptly. And again, a reminder that tomorrow morning 9 o'clock comes early when you're or late when you're traveling in the traffic sometimes. And also that tomorrow night there's a service that's open to everyone. So if you're here and you're not a registered attendee at this conference, you're most welcome to come tomorrow evening when John Buchanan will be giving a lecture. And so we do look forward to that at 7:30 p.m. tomorrow night. This is an opportunity for us to become better acquainted with our four guests. And so I'm not going to speak, but I've given them some questions in advance to reflect on. I'll tell you what they are, and then I'm going to let them go. And Paul is going to sort of make sure that they all stay on track. Good, I surprised them. Here are some of the questions that I gave to them, and they don't have to answer them all, just whatever they can. And when the time comes, we'll just stand up and say thank you. And so thank you for coming. Tell us about your call to preach. What voices and influences have led you thus far? Tell us about mentors along the way, or books you read, or sermons you heard that stayed with you. What are some of the challenges you faced as a preacher, and how have you dealt with those challenges? Tell us about the fulfillment you found in preaching. And anything else you want to talk about. It's really a chance for us to get to know you a little bit better, so thank you for being with us.
Would you like to go first?
I always like to go first. Mostly because I'm afraid that I'll be talking at the end, bearing my soul, pouring myself out in this way that Californians have, of telling you everything about themselves. And then Peter will stand up and say, well, that's it. Since I don't want to be in that position, then I'll be glad to go first. One of the first questions on Peter's list is the classic question about the sense of call. I'm happy to talk about that. And about early influences on our preaching. Really doubly happy to talk about that because I had a Damascus Road experience on Route 1 in New Jersey in the late 1970s. I don't know if any of you have ever happened to travel in that part of the east coast of the U.S., but Route 1 is named because it was the first highway, and it's layer upon layer of grit. It's, a Dunkin' Donuts that's built on top of a used car lot that was built on top of a mom and pop grocery. It's a miserable drive, but I was driving down that road, and I had a sensation of light. In the middle of my frustrated praying, I had a sensation of light, and I had a small sense of a voice, and the voice said, you could go to seminary. The voice did not say, I call you to preach. The voice did not say, I will bless your preaching. The voice did not say anything about that. I just thought I would go to seminary and study theology and apply it to theater, which I already loved. So I think it's kind of funny. I love to tell that story now. I think it's kind of funny because I did also fall in love with preaching and with the tremendous privilege of preaching. But what I think is funny is that the voice did not say, I call you to be a minister or a pastor or even a preacher, because actually as it's ended up, I spent 3 years of my life in parish ministry and 29 in theological education. So the voice saying to me, you could go to seminary, turned out to be a predictor of a big part of my life. And practically on the first day, the first step of that path, I heard one of the most memorable sermons that I have ever heard, a sermon that has stuck with me now for 30 years, and it was preached by Gail Raschuti, who is here tonight. One of the first trailblazing women. I count myself to be on the middle of the first wave of women, or maybe even the back lip of the first wave of women in ministry, but Gail was on the front lip, and she set the standard high and gave us a lovely model for what a woman might look like, standing in the Gothic cathedral of Princeton University Chapel and preaching on how we should load our knapsacks for ministry. Memorable to this day, Gail. So glad to have a chance to thank you.
Well, I guess I'll go next. I get nervous whenever people ask about a sense of call because mine is so very modest and ordinary, and I came to ministry through the back door, and that reluctantly. I'd like to say that I was called to seminary, but what actually happened was I approached graduation from college and didn't know what to do with the rest of my life, as is the case with a lot of people. And I was fortunate enough to have an advisor who said to me, he knew me well, and he said, well, why don't you take a year or so off and go somewhere where you can ask and pursue the questions that you've been asking and pursuing in college, the big questions of good and evil and the meaning of life. And he said, you'll never have another opportunity to do this. He said, why don't you go to the University of Chicago Divinity School? I said, Divinity School? I don't want to be a minister. And he said, that's all right, they don't care about that there. But they will give you a theological education. They'll give you a good, broad, philosophic education. You can ask the questions you want to, and they don't care whether you commit to ministry or not. And they've got a lot of money. They'll probably pay you to come there, all of which was true. And so with that modest urging, I ended up at the University of Chicago Divinity School and slowly got hooked by the connection between the great questions of humankind and the Church of Jesus Christ, and got hooked by world-class scholars who in their hearts were humble followers of Jesus, and that combination compelled me. Now, as I look back over 50 years, I'm now unabashedly saying and confessing that was the Spirit moving in my life. I didn't know it at the time, would not have ever thought of using those words, but things really are much clearer in retrospect. And that's my call. I ended up in a small parish in northern Indiana, and without ever, at Chicago, no preaching courses, no homiletics. I never read a book. I ended up in a small parish, a student pastor, and that first sermon I put in everything I knew about everything, starting and finished up, and then had the horrible realization, oh my gosh, I got to do this again in a week. And so then began to read, and listen carefully to people who were doing it.
Well, I had an experience I think a lot of folks that end up in seminary have, which is I would sit on Sunday morning and listen to the sermon, but I couldn't listen to the sermon. I kept thinking about all the other things the text might say, and all these possibilities. And that said nothing about the sermons. They were all fine, I'm sure. It said a lot more about my own lack of attention span. But each time I would hear a passage read, I would just start thinking about all the many things it might mean, and got so excited about those possibilities that it soon seemed like I was doomed to seminary. And I think ever since then, what most excites me about preaching is to open a passage, whether it's relatively new to you and somewhat obscure, you've heard it 100 times, and be listening for all the possibilities and resist the sense that it has to mean one thing. And sometimes that really is persons we've heard preach before, or different voices or perspectives, persons from different parts of the globe. Every time I open the text, there's this sense of being surrounded by that great cloud of witnesses. And for me, that's always been freeing, to imagine that these same words can mean multiple and different things, and sometimes even seem kind of conflicting, and yet at that time, at that moment, for those people, it is, to use the old words, meet, right, and salutary. And as long as that keeps being the case, I think I'll be happy to keep preaching.
I remember being in grade 6, and I think I must have wanted to be a minister and must have expressed it to the family members at that time, because my sister said to me at one time, "Oh, Paul, you'll never be a minister using language like that." And I remember it was particularly cutting to me. I felt that deeply. I don't know when I was first called, but I do know that I left the church when I was 16. And I only returned to it out of crisis. I was studying in England, doing my doctoral work, and I wasn't a Christian. I was studying English literature. And I had gone to an anti-Vietnam War poetry reading by Vanessa Redgrave, at the Young Vic Theatre. And I'd gone with a fellow Canadian who was also studying over there. And on our way back, I'd stopped to tie my shoe. It was a desert boot. Tells you when this was. And he kept on walking. David kept on walking, and I heard a car coming up quickly. I could hear the shifting, of sports car. And without looking at him, I looked to where the car was coming and said, David, David, look out. And I expected that he was going to be in the island that the crosswalks have in England. In the middle of the road, there's an island. And I thought he would be safely there, but for some reason he had frozen. And he was hit by the car. And so I had to contact his parents in Canada, and then meet them, and then take them to the hospital. And it was a very difficult experience. And I knew that they wanted to have a prayer, so I said, well, maybe we should go down to the chapel in the hospital. And yes, we'd like to do that. So we got down, found the chapel in the basement of University College Hospital, very musty, and found the light switch, a bit of red carpet, nothing inviting, but there we were. And I thought, somebody should say a prayer, because their son had serious brain damage. And then I thought, maybe that somebody should be me. So I said a prayer, but it wasn't really my first prayer. I mean, it was a prayer I said out of duty, out of memory, growing up in the church, but my first real prayer was about 12 weeks later, when he had already been flown back to Canada. He was in a hospital here. He'd been flown back with full medical team. I went to see him, and he was sitting up in the chair. All the bruises were gone, the swelling was gone. But when I spoke to him, his eyes did not move. There was no one there. And that night I went to a shopping mall, and I found myself reaching in my pocket for a coin as I was walking past a wishing well. And then I thought, no, this is stupid. If I'm going to say a wish, I might as well say a prayer. And I still don't know that it was the right kind of prayer to say. It was just the prayer that I said. I said, oh God, I pray that you will either heal David so his parents won't have to suffer, or that you would let him die. There was nothing about his appearance. When I saw him in hospital that day, there was nothing about his appearance that was in any way indicative that he wasn't healthy, except for the fact that he wasn't there. The next day he died. And it didn't prove to me anything. It didn't prove that there was a God, but it proved, well, maybe it was kind of a burning bush thing. Maybe I better check this out. And one thing led to another. I really did wish that there wasn't a God, but turned out that there was, and I had to change my life. I think that was my real calling. Mm-hmm. We've got time to answer another question. So let me just remind you what some of those were. It could have been voices and influences that led you this far. Could be books that you read, or challenges that you faced as a preacher and how you've dealt with them, or the fulfillment you found in preaching.
I think I would like to say just a quick word about a challenge. I'm trying to decide if it's really about preaching. It's mostly about teaching preaching. But when some of you here who went to seminary a number of years ago may have had a similar experience. From what I understand about the way that preaching is taught in this part of the world, I doubt it. I think the teachers of preaching here, like Paul and his colleagues, are gentle, constructive teachers. But my teachers in the late 70s and the early 80s were tough, cut you off at the knees kinds of teachers of preaching. And even on a couple of occasions, they were angry teachers of preaching. And when I first began to teach, I began to understand that a little bit more. You do get frustrated. You do get frustrated. But early on, so I think I'm talking about the challenge of managing your own anger. I suppose it could apply to preaching, but I'm thinking now of being a young teacher and trying to learn to set aside my own frustration in the classroom. I knew that I didn't want to be like those people who cut me off at the knees and cut my classmates off at the knees. I knew I didn't want to use that style of teaching. And I believed in the idea I adopted from medicine, first do no harm. So I thought that would be the first rule of my pedagogy, first do no harm. I started with that. But early on, I really struggled. You know, if you're not going to just go for the jugular every time a young preacher stands up, if you're going to resist that, then what should you do? But in the first several years that I was teaching, I was mentored by a great woman professor, also a homiletician named Edwina Hunter, the most gentle voice in the classroom you would ever want to meet. And I sat with her in the classroom over and over again in those first several years, watching her teach and seeing how she set aside her own frustration and focused on finding something good to say to the students. And so I was helped very much by Edwina Hunter, by her example. And once you've been in that kind of a classroom where people are supporting each other and where people are willing to risk a little bit, it's its own reward. You know, you don't want to go back to being the kind of vent your frustration on the students kind of a teacher of preaching. So I'm grateful to Edwina and to other women and men instructors I've known who have helped me wrestle with that over the years. And I'm interested in the question of frustration and anger in preaching. I heard Paul say once, I think I've said this to him since, and I think he disavowed that he ever said it, but I heard him say this once. I heard him say, you know what's different? What's the difference between a prophetic sermon and a harangue? And I said, no, what's the difference? And he said, it's a harangue if the preacher enjoys it. So I'm interested in that issue in preaching, the question of what we do with our anger and our frustration and how sometimes subtly and not so subtly it creeps into our preaching, and certainly in my case from time to time in my teaching.
Probably the biggest transition in my preaching came right in the middle. I've been doing it for 50 years, so 25 years ago. Early, I was under the influence of the old shibboleth that you ought never to let anything personal leak into the sermon, and you should never use the personal pronoun. It was not about you, it's about gospel, it's about the word. Keep yourself out, don't get in the way, all that sort of thing. So that's what I did, and if you do it for 50 years, you don't ever want to go back and read that stuff that you wrote 50 years ago. It's really dry. Anyhow, when I was called to Fourth Presbyterian Church in Chicago, which is a pretty big church and with a reputation for a pulpit, and I thought, oh my Lord, now what am I going to do? So I got on the phone and called Jim Forbes at Riverside Church, and he was teaching at Union, and I introduced myself, and I said, teach me what to do. Tell me how I can do this. And he said, well, come along with me. I'm going to do a preaching seminar for some Methodists in upstate New York. So I went. And Jim began by saying preaching is basically testimony. And that word made me very nervous. I remember from childhood going with childhood chums to Baptist Young People's Union where they testified, and I could make up stories as good as anybody else, so I did that. But so Jim said to this group of about 25 Methodists and me, I want you all now one at a time to come up here and tell the rest of us what the Spirit is doing in your life. And I thought, I'd like to get out of here right now. But we did that, and I did that, and then I listened very carefully to Forbes, who said, this really isn't about you at all. It's about Christ. It's not about you. But if you don't believe it, you have no business thinking anyone else is going to believe it too. So of course you filter this through yourself. So at that point, my preaching changed, and I began to take some risks and hopefully never overdid it. There are dangers of self-congratulatory rhetoric and making yourself a hero, but I found at that point that connections were happening when I allowed a little bit of my experience and myself to come into the sermons. Thanks to Jim Forbes.
Well, I'll share a bit about what I've been thinking about lately with regard to preaching. I've been doing a lot of reading the last year or two about narrative and story and narrative theory, and I'll say a little more about that in the next day or two, but have been really struck by the way in which we are narrative beings. We're constantly narrating a story, trying to make sense of life in and through stories. And about a year ago, a little over a year and a half ago, I wrote a couple of short pieces for the Huffington Post on atheism. The first one was it was meant tongue-in-cheek, is atheism becoming a religion? Because they're building churches and training leaders and humanist chaplains, and it really was meant with a sense of humor. And I was immediately surprised by two things. A lot of atheists read the Huffington Post religion section. And it's hard to convey a sense of humor in print because they were very unhappy. 2,000 comments, angry comments later. I wrote a second piece on called Atheists and the F Word, which was faith. Inviting a conversation and saying, don't you think at some point we all make a wager, we all take a leap of faith, even beyond the question of does God exist? We're constantly projecting a world that we can't prove, but our gambling is accurate, and that didn't engender any better of a response. But I did get a letter from a publisher saying he'd been working with a young atheist writer who was looking for a partner to dialogue, and would I be interested? He appreciated those pieces. And so for the last 18 months or so, we've been working on a book together, a dialogue book, and it's been really challenging. I often find myself on that border of, can this really be true? And he is such a sharp, clear thinker, asks very good, honest, and hard questions, and it's been back and forth. And what I keep coming back to is this odd place of vulnerability that I think is finally where the faith was born and lives, and where sermons come from, which is simply to acknowledge finally there is no proving this. I mean, I can't argue him into where I'm at, and we had agreed from the beginning we weren't going to try to convert each other, but really have an honest and hard but respectful conversation. But I keep coming back to, in the end, all I can say is it's a better story than the other stories I've been offered and exposed to. And that's not much, really, but it's often enough. And so as I think about preaching and the task of ministry, I'm often now thinking, is part of our task to invite people to imagine a better story for themselves than the one they've accepted. That is God, not is God, God is, but to invite them to imagine that God is not done with their story and that sees them differently than maybe they've seen themselves or the world has seen them. And so on Sundays now I think about what element of this story, of this grand and glorious story, do we get to tell and ask, sometimes very indirectly, sometimes very directly, is the story you are living sufficient to the weight of meaning you need and deserve? And to invite Christian faith as not all the answers, but as at least the better story that we've heard thus far. And that's been pretty meaningful for me. Thanks.
There have been so many people who've been influential for me, but I think I'll go back to the same time frame, because there was probably the person who shaped my ministry more than anyone else was Daniel T. Jenkins. I had taken, when David's parents came over to England, I took them on Sundays to try and find a worship service that would be meaningful for them. First time I took them to St. Paul's Cathedral. I mean, what's a church? I just took them there. It was such a cold service. Sorry to any Anglicans here. It was just not what we were needing at that moment. It was a beautiful service. Next week I took them to Central Hall, which is a great big Methodist hall in London. And we were about the first people out of the door, and unfortunately David's mother needed to tell her story to the minister on the steps of the church. And you could tell, how, as a negative example, you could tell he wasn't really wanting to hear it. She finished it as quickly as she could, and then he said, "Oh, that's nice." He hadn't heard a thing she was saying because he was looking down the row to see who he was going to shake hands with. The third week we went to Daniel T. Jenkins Church, a very small church in Russell Square, just across from the British Museum and on the campus of University of London. And such an intimate little service, small. He was a wonderful scholar, a Bart scholar, and he would preach a 30-minute sermon in the morning, and in the evening, to only 15 people, he would preach another 30-minute sermon. And there was such dedication and humility in that, such contrast between the two. But it was important, though, for me, and Daniel T. Jenkins was the one who not only modeled that for me about preaching and how it doesn't matter how many people you're preaching to. In some ways, every time you preach, you're preaching to the whole communion of saints. You've got a larger congregation than you could ever count. And not that numbers matter. And he also said something that has served me well in my own ministry. He said, every time you have a few minutes, write something down. Don't let it pass. Just keep on working on writing. Whether it's your sermon, whether it's prayers, whether it's whatever, just keep doing it, and you will find that you don't have the pressure that you have if you leave things till the end of the week. Well, I think we're just about Peter. Where's Peter? Peter.
Thank you very much. First of all, I want to say welcome to Gail Trudy, who's come to us from Colgate Rochester Crozier Divinity College. She's leading workshops, and Jana mentioned her. So I'd like you to stand up, Gail, because it's wonderful to have you with us. We look forward to a great day tomorrow and Tuesday. Let's stand together and say the grace.